All right, so welcome everyone. My name is Allison Portnow-Lathrop, and I'm the head of public programs at the Ackland Art Museum, and we're very excited to welcome you to our first ever virtual Art for Lunch webinar. This series usually happens 3 or 4 times a semester in our galleries when available, and it's a conversation between Elizabeth Manekin, our head of university programs and academic projects, who just waved, and a UNC faculty member who has been working with the museum and bringing their class to the museum for the past couple of weeks or months or sometimes even years to engage with the art in an interesting way with the curriculum. So I'm going to introduce our speakers today, and then Elizabeth will kick things off with questions and answers for our special guest, and then we will open up later on in the talk to you all and answer some questions that way. So I'm pleased to introduce Elizabeth Manekin. She is the head of university programs and academic projects at the Ackland, and in this role she works with faculty across UNC campus and other area universities and colleges to plan visits to the Ackland, to engage with curricula across a multitude of disciplines, everything from medical education to, of course, art history, English, all sorts of things, where the museum is touching a wide variety of different academic initiatives. And in addition to this, Elizabeth works with our teaching fellows at the museum and our Ackland student guides who give some of the public tours you might have had an opportunity to see when the galleries were open. And she works on our Ackland upstairs space and curates that space along with faculty, where we have 2 rotating installations per semester. So in 6 sections, so we end up with, what would that be, a total of 24 installations or so an academic year. So in addition to Elizabeth today, we have our special guest, Professor Jerma Jackson from UNC's History Department. Professor Jackson's specialty is in 20th century social and cultural history with an emphasis on African-American life, religion, music, and women's history. And Professor Jackson has been using the Ackland's collection this semester along with Elizabeth and an installation in Ackland upstairs that we didn't get much of a chance to see. But Professor Jackson's been using the Ackland's works with a course called African-American History since 1865. So we'll hear more about that today. So please join me in welcoming them today.
Thank you so much, Allison. Hard to hear over the raucous applause.
Yeah.
But I'm so delighted to virtually be here and to be with Jerma Jackson, who is just a delight to work with, and it's nice to see her face in these times of isolation. So thank you, Jerma, for being here. And just to kick off our conversation, I was hoping you could share a little bit more about your research, not necessarily in tandem with the museum, but more broadly, what do you do as a historian?
Elizabeth, thanks for having me. I really do look at African-American life in the 20th century, and most recently, I'm exploring the new Negro era from the perspective of aging former slaves. And in particular, I'm really interested in how individuals, many of these were children, enslaved as children, how they perceived an array of developments that happened in the 20th century. For example, widespread schooling, the rise of lynching and indiscriminate violence, as well as the rise of leisure and commercialized recreation. I mean, very different kinds of developments. And I'm really interested in looking at how they perceive these things. When we think about this era, we often think about young people. But for this project, I decided to flip it and think about old people. And let me just say, the thing that's kind of interesting about it is kind of discovering how visual culture can offer some unexpected insights about these questions that I've been looking at. And so in particular, I've been really interested in how you could take visual art, photography, paintings, portraits, and put them in conversation with interviews, materials from the archives. And so for me, that's been really exciting and fun. So.
Wonderful. Well, and on that note, what are some of the ways in which your research and your teaching intersect with the museum?
You know, it's funny when Allison asked a question, what piece of art would you want to take home from the Ackland?
Yeah.
For me, the answer is simple: mending socks. Motley's mending socks.
Interesting.
It's a work I have been working with for a long time, and I think it sheds light on older people.
Jerma, for those less familiar with the Ackland's collection or who don't know mending socks, can you describe it for them?
Yeah, I mean, it was done by Archibald Motley. It's a portrait of his grandmother, Emily Motley, who was enslaved, and I think she was born around 1840s, 1850s, and she is surrounded by the things she likes. And in the left-hand corner is a portrait that her former mistress gave to her before, you know, at emancipation. And oh my gosh, I mean, it's an incredible piece, and it speaks to what the grandmother, the things of value to her, but it also captures this dynamic between grandson and, you know, his grandmother, because only half of this prized heirloom is in the portrait. So it's a portrait of a portrait.
Yeah.
It's just a fascinating piece.
Yeah. And you spoke a little bit about how images are starting to enter into this current book project and your research. Are there other ways in which you feel the works in the Ackland's collection have catalyzed discussions in your classes, or how do you feel like it's informed your teaching?
Well, you know, the thing that I have really been thinking a lot about is how can I give students as many tools as I can think of to make sense of a rapidly changing world. And so since I do not focus on art in my classes, I always like to take out some time to do something different, to do something that kind of crosses the course in a different direction. And that can raise all kinds of new questions about the very questions that we are looking at in the classroom. And so coming to the Ackland offers that opportunity.
Yeah.
And you know, what's fascinating is how students respond to that. You know, some students, it's their first time coming to the Ackland. Some students have been before. You know, I had a student last semester, actually, who didn't say much in class. She came to the Ackland, to the workshop, and she was so moved. And I was like, oh my gosh, I've given her a gift. And in fact, I mean, she said, I don't want to leave. And I, afterwards I talked to her, I said, then you need to take some art classes, some art, you need to do something more so you can engage with these materials. And she looked up some courses, she found some things, actually found someone who was teaching, and I said, she's kind of interested. She got in.
Yeah.
And I was just so happy to make that connection. And had we not gone to the Ackland, I would have not known. And so, she was a freshman. It was a class with lots of seniors, juniors. She found her voice by that workshop, and that was great. But that's one way that I've used the materials. The other way, I always want to have my students think about. So when they go to the Ackland, we'll look at 3 works or so. And they are charged with focusing on one of those works and putting that work in conversation with some element from the course, whether it's a film, whether it's a reading, anything, they get to choose. But the point is to put the art in conversation with the course and use that conversation and connection to think about how they are gaining a deeper understanding about history, or about African American women, or about music. I mean, it varies. That question varies depending on the specific course I'm teaching. But it's always that issue of going to the Ackland, connecting the work to something in the course, and then using that connection to, reflect on a broader question.
And are there specific works or a specific work or two that come to mind in sort of serving as examples of those connections?
Yeah, like, well, I think one of one that I really found interesting was that a woman wrote about Hal Woodruff's piece, Mississippi, Land Erosion. And she said, and she's in my course this term, she said that piece gave her a new perspective on the Great Migration. Now, the really interesting thing about this comment is that we spent a lot of time on the Great Migration. I mean, probably we spent a whole week studying this. We looked at kind of a broad overview of the Great Migration. Then we looked at, we actually looked at the experience of workers, who found jobs in these cities where they migrated. And then we did this other really interesting article on the informal economy and how women created jobs in the informal economy. So we spent a lot of time talking about the Great Migration. And in spite of all that time, she came away having looked at this Woodruff piece, that it gave her this other vantage point that she had not considered. That vantage point is that the sheer difficulty of migrating.
Yeah.
She had not, she was always focused on the possibility of migration, or the, unrealistic expectations of what those cities could be. The Woodruff piece made her think about the difficulty of leaving.
Yeah.
And I just thought that was incredible. And this whole notion of just how leaving transformed, how environmental conditions transform daily lives for people in the South.
Absolutely. So for those of you at home looking at the screen, this is a painting by an American artist named Hale Woodruff, an African-American artist who, this is a point in his career where he's really shifting from representing people and figures and scenes of daily life to more abstract work. And when we look at this with the class, they talk about what they see, they talk about the brush strokes, which are less visible in a reproduction than they are in person, but a lot of the words and sort of emotional qualities that this brings to mind are sort of an aftermath, destruction. There's sort of a chaos and a sweeping motion. And so some of the difficulty that Professor Jackson is talking about is embedded in some of the emotional responses that the students, that were elicited in the students through looking at this piece.
Yeah, wow. Yeah. So on that note, though, I think there's another piece, sometimes the students throw a curveball at me. And, we did the quilt by Irene Williams. And I must tell you, I was not prepared for the amount of just debate that this piece generated among students. And I think primarily because, in my courses, I often focus on working class people, like on the ground, like daily life. That's something we really look at in my courses. This, to me, is a perfect example of the artistic version of that daily life. What I was not prepared for is the really, really thorny questions that this piece raises for students about, well, is it really art? That was one issue. Another issue was the notion that it is in a museum is problematic for some. Mm-hmm. For others, it was a profound appreciation that it was in a museum.
Yeah.
And so, wow, that piece provoked a range of reactions. And one of the things I really appreciated is that it raises questions about what is art, what is culture. Issues that, when you look at Woodruff, you don't ask that question.
Right.
So I was, that was great. But it was a curveball.
Absolutely.
For me, but a good one.
Yeah. And I remember, at least with one of your classes, when we were looking at this, several of the students even picked out specific patterns that they recognized of like, oh, my grandfather has pajama pants in that pattern.
Yes.
That looked like one of my grandmother's church shirts. And
yeah, there was a real connection to it.
Yeah.
And then to the piece, but was it art? And so my question is like, what is art? I mean, and what is culture? I mean, culture is in the ways people express themselves, the outlooks they have. I mean, it's not some big possession you have to have.
Yeah.
This is something that didn't come up before. So that's a good thing. Yeah.
Absolutely. Any other works that that come to mind? Either from classes past?
Yeah, sure. The ironing board,
Oh, I don't think we have a picture of the Willie Cole, but we can get one maybe.
What was that? I can't remember the artist.
His name is Willie Cole.
Yes, Willie Cole honoring the women in his family who had been domestic workers.
Yeah, his immediate and extended family.
Yes.
So it's from a series called The Beauties.
That's right. Yes. The thing that was interesting about that piece, and we studied it in a African-American women's history course. A number of the students, at one point the students didn't know it was a flattened ironing board. It reminded them of those images of the Middle Passage in the ship. So a lot of students wrote about those connections, but I had some students who probably weren't as well versed in art as they were in history. For them, the piece allowed them to think, they kind of applied our readings on domestic workers, and it helped them see the piece in a new light. And what that helped me appreciate was how the dynamic relationship between history and art. Often I think about how artists expand our ideas about the past. But it's also possible that history can help expand our appreciation of the visual. And so I thought that was great. And students went back and forth, in terms of which informed the other, as it were.
For those of you at home, we don't have a visual, but imagine, if you will, an ironing board that's been stripped of all of the foam and the sort of fabric on top of it. So it's just the foundational metal structure. And then the artist, Willie Cole, basically, he ran over them with his car. He purchased a bunch of them at Goodwill, basically. And he would run over the metal with his car. He would hammer it and dent it and flattened it out to make it a printing plate. And so he put ink on it and he ran it through a printing press. And so the work of art that Professor Jackson is talking about is over 5 foot tall, singular vertical ironing board, impression of an ironing board that is evocative of a mummy's tomb, an oversized bullet, a diagram of a slave ship. There are any number of sort of visceral sort of associations and responses to that. But when students think not only about what they're seeing, and when they're thinking about what does a domestic worker do, of course, and what are the kinds of abuses that these women and many of the women and sort of family friends of Willie Cole's were subjected to, this sort of thinking about ironing, but also thinking about heat, about pressure, about sort of surviving, not only surviving, but sort of triumphing over these kinds of indignities. It's a really powerful piece. Actually, that might be one of the ones that I would take home. I love Willie Cole very much. So, but that unfortunately you can Google it later. But yeah, it's a great work. So, in thinking about the sort of the multitude of works, Professor Jackson's been working with the museum for a while. And next in our segment is a wild card activity, which I'm very excited. She doesn't know what they are. This is from a game that my colleagues and I developed at the Ackland. Game is a loose term. It's Musings, which is a deck of cards that you can pick up at the front desk of the Ackland when we reopen. But they're conceived as sort of conversation starters. They're either, some are more philosophical, some are a little silly, some, for example, are would you rather propositions, like the one that you received in your poll at the beginning. But I've pre-selected several that Professor Jackson is going to draw from. And there are, let's see, there are 4 of them. And so sort of trying to simulate some of the random picking that might have happened in real life. Jerma, please pick a number 1 through 4.
2.
Okay. Oh, this is a good one.
Okay.
Okay, so this is a quote by Leo Tolstoy. The activity of art is as important as the activity of language itself, and as universal. So that's by Leo Tolstoy. What are the differences between the way visual art and spoken language communicate?
Oh.
You're a music person. This is a good one for you. You can use music too if you'd rather.
Well, here's the thing. Oh, I have an answer. The
Great.
answer for me is language manifests itself in words, right?
Yeah, keep going with that.
Art
Elaborate on that.
engages that which cannot be spoken. The utterances, feelings that you can articulate with words, but words do not fully capture.
Yeah, unless you speak German.
Well, I mean, the thing is with writing, the way you capture feeling is through sentences, through layering. But there's always, and in that space between the word and the layer is the meaning, is the emotion, is the feeling. Art captures that visually.
Yeah.
So it is really similar, but I love that the issue of utterance.
Yeah.
The thing that the words just don't come. And so what is uttered is something that is not a word, but it is a sound.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the visual does that. And, I think musicians in particular play with that issue of utterance, so it's that space between that I think, I love that question.
I thought you might. I pre-selected a couple that I thought, they're not softballs, but I figured you might like them.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
Good. All right. I think we should do another one because I like these, and that was a lovely answer.
Okay, sure.
All right, 1 through 3.
Oh, let's try 3.
Okay. This is a Gustave Courbet quote, and unfortunately, he's like a little wordy. He's a better painter than writer, maybe. Okay. Beauty, like truth, is a thing which is relative to the time in which one lives and to the individual capable of understanding it. The expression of beauty, of the beautiful, bears a precise relation to power of perception acquired by the artist. I'm going to read it again, and then there's a question, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Beauty, like truth, is a thing which is relative to the time in which one lives and to the individual capable of understanding it.
Mm-hmm.
The expression of the beautiful bears a precise relation to the power of perception acquired by the artist. So that's Gustave Courbet, a painter.
Mm-hmm.
So in what ways are your ideas of beauty specific to our cultural moment? And in what ways are they timeless?
Wow. I don't know if I think of beauty as timeless. I do think of it as there's so much that can be beautiful. I do think it is contingent on the moment, in the moment of what we are in. I'm always amazed, just when I think about growing up grew up in the projects in Newport News, Virginia. And what I was always amazed at is how the ways in which people created beauty around them.
Mhm.
So for example, women, I just remember growing up, and these women, they would spend a lot of time trying to figure out what to plant, what flowers to plant in a very limited amount of space that they had. But the point was to have color and beauty as a way of reminding them that life was more than the job they did, the inadequate money that they earned, and that it was just right there in front of them, and they could create that. And so I am so intrigued by people who, artists who take conditions that seem the absence of beauty and find elements of beauty in them. And how people living in those circumstances find that. I mean, that is incredibly powerful and meaningful. And to discover what other people find beautiful, how they deem what is beautiful. It's just so moving to me.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Thank you for that.
Yeah, I mean, I feel, I don't want to brag, but I feel like I pre-selected your questions pretty well. You did like a beautiful job. Thank you.
Sure.
All right, so you already told us if you were allowed to take one home. I want to make sure we have time for questions from our audience. So last question for you. Would you rather have to describe everything you see at a museum out loud all the time, or never be able to say a word about what you've seen to anyone?
Are you asking me?
I'm asking you. We've already
absolutely.
asked,
Let me tell you.
our studio audience.
Actually, that is a simple one.
Yeah.
I would much rather talk about it all the time. If I had the choice, of not being able to speak,
right,
I would have to talk about it all the time.
Interesting. Yeah. Cool. Allison, what did our audience go with?
Let's find the results.
Fascinating.
Wow.
Pretty close.
Yeah. Wait, can they see that, Allison?
I think so.
Yeah, good. Cool.
So it looks like more people would prefer to describe everything out loud all the time. I'm in that category too, I have to say.
I am not.
Really?
No, I would rather not say anything than talk all the time about it. But anyway, great. Jerma, thank you so much. I think now we are going to open it up to questions.
Sure.
Which I think Allison has several and will feed them to us.
I do. And if there are more questions that you've thought of in the time that Elizabeth and Jerma have been speaking, then feel free to type them into the Q&A box and I'll hunt for them. But I thought I'd start out by asking something that it seems a couple of our participants wanted to know more about. And it's, how does the process of picking works for a class visit work? Is it the Ackland person who selects the work? Is it the professor? Is it a mix? How does that go about?
So I'm more than happy to answer this. I contact the Ackland, I want a class and want to do a session, and then I have these incredible meetings with Elizabeth, in which I lay out the goals for the course, and then she suggests some readings that can accomplish those goals. And then we kind of go back and forth from there. And narrowing down, making sure there's a range. But I actually think that is an incredible process. That, you know, you're kind of thinking, okay, here's my goal. But then, and sometimes, you know, you have this goal and then I meet with Elizabeth and then I realize, oh, I can fine tune that goal because these are the works we've come up with. So.
And in general, the process, so I would say that with Jerma, it's a very collaborative process where she comes in, I have some works of art in mind, we do the go, back and forth that she just mentioned and sort of fine tune from there. Some faculty come in and they say, I want to look at these 3 things, and they teach it themselves. Sometimes people come in and they say, I hear you work with my department and I don't really understand how that happens. What can you do? And so there are all different levels of collaboration. But when I and the rest of the teaching staff are working with faculty, we always begin with sort of what are their learning objectives? Because sometimes it's a specific time period. Sometimes it's a sort of context or content specific moment. But sometimes it's a concept that they're trying to work through. Like we've worked with, the anthropology of war and peace, where they're trying to look at representations of violence in different cultures and time periods. So that's a bit of more of an abstract idea that we're trying to concretize and contextualize in the museum. So there's a range of processes, but yeah, Jerma and I have some epic meetings.
That's great. And so how about, how do you start the conversations once the students are in the galleries?
We always begin with usually one of 2 questions. What do you see? And you often have to assure undergraduates and most people that it's not a trick question. You're not secretly asking them what they know about the painting, but instead what they see. And then there are some works where either there's a lot going on visually or they're more abstract, like the Hale Woodruff, where sometimes it's generative to have them start with gut reactions, even if they don't articulate them. But what words come to mind when you look at it? It might be chaos, it might be storm. And even if they're not articulating it after they've thought about it, I will prompt them to say, what do you see that inspired that response? So they're already substantiating those observations with visual evidence. But sort of backing up from that, a lot of students, they're taught to read words, but they're not taught to read visual and material culture. So we always have to begin by reading the thing in front of us, and then we can move on to interpretation and analysis. Jerma, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that was, wow, you captured that very well. Yeah, I mean, and then the way in which those kinds of open-ended questions allow students, it creates its own force. Students feel safe. Okay, this is what I see. Oh, well, so-and-so saw this. But that gave me a clue. I see that, but then I see this other thing. And so it becomes more dynamic. Mm-hmm. And that's very, very good. And so you kind of work through the layers of that, getting to reading, getting to interpretation. And then, but I think that makes students feel safe because they often walk in a museum and it's like, this isn't my home.
Yeah.
So you have to kind of shed that. And I think it really works effectively. And so it's a collaborative process of people building on each other's impressions. And, what somebody sees allows them to see something else. And the thing that's amazing about art is that, I had a student once who said, we could spend the whole day here looking at this art and we would still see something new.
Could spend a lifetime, yeah.
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 I guess on that note, folks would like to know, are there surprises that have come up in talking about art with your students? Did the students see something that you have overlooked, or things that you didn't notice before?
For me, absolutely. Sure. This happens. When I go to these, workshops, they are I'm a student too. And so that's, I'm learning, I have a little more knowledge, but I'm learning the way they are learning. And so I like that. So yeah, for example, I had a student, there was the Rose Piper.
That's a good one.
What's the name?
It's Slow Down Freight Train.
Yes, Slow Down Freight Train. And as students were commenting on it, a number of them talked about the androgynous character of the of the piece, and actually wrote on that. And I just thought that was very, very insightful. Yeah. And I thought, she did a great job. But that was clearly a case that I may have thought about it, but the students named it very quickly.
Yeah. And for just a little bit more context on this painting, it was done as part of an exhibition that Rose Piper created that was, all of the works were inspired by different blues and I think what was deemed at the time Negro folk music. And so in thinking about the expressive qualities that Professor Jackson was talking about before, this is a painting responding to a song, responding to the Great Migration. So in some ways it's collapsing the words of the woman who's lamenting her lover's, journey north, but also thinking about, what does it feel like to have to leave your home, to have to leave the woman you love? And so the student that Jerma is referring to is sort of talking about that collapsing of gender roles and the expressive potential of this painting. Yeah.
So I think we have time for one more question. How about, what do you do when you have students who aren't so engaged with the art? How do you get them interested?
I have not had that problem. Actually, what I have students who have been reluctant or ambivalent. I've had more, the problem has been more of ambivalence than reluctance or a kind of unwillingness. I think students are very excited to get out of the classroom. That, if nothing else, they're excited to go to the Ackland because they're not going to be in class that day. And so there's an openness to, okay, what might this be? There is an intimidation factor and an ambivalence, but what I often find is that students loosen up in the course of a kind of 75-minute session and find themselves having to be a little open, and plus I always connect it to an assignment. So they, they may not like it, but they have to come and they're going to write a paper. So they have to be more attentive. And that works.
Great. Well, thank you so much, both to you, Jerma Jackson, and Elizabeth Manekin. We hope to have more talks like this in the near future in the virtual realm. And those will, of course, appear on our museum's website, ackland.org, in our Ackland at Home section, which you can find a link to right from the home page. If you haven't signed up for our e-news, you can always find information about that there. But I guess for now, please join me in thanking our panelists. We'll assume they can hear your applause from all over Chapel Hill and around the the Triangle and who knows where else. So thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jerma.
All right, have a wonderful afternoon, everyone.